Newport was the kind of place you'd expect to see on a postcard. The streets were lined with pristine two-story homes, picket fences, and well-manicured lawns. The people here knew each other by name, waved as they passed by, and held neighborhood barbecues every other weekend. It was the picture-perfect slice of suburban America. But behind those closed doors, the tranquility was nothing more than an illusion. Newport had its secrets, dark, buried, and ready to explode. At the center of this illusion was the Parker family. To their neighbors, they were the epitome of success and stability. Jonathan Parker, a well-respected lawyer in town, commanded respect. His wife, Claire, was the model suburban mom, always involved in PTA meetings, hosting dinners, and making sure her two kids were top of their class. From the outside looking in, they had it all. The white picket fence, the shiny new cars, the picture-perfect marriage. But anyone who looked closely could see that the Parker household was a pressure cooker, ready to blow. It was the summer of 2019 when everything started to unravel. The air was thick with humidity and the kind of heat that clung to your skin, making every movement feel sluggish. Newport was basking in the calm before a storm. In this town, people thought they knew everything about everyone. But the truth was far more twisted than any of them could ever imagine. Jonathan Parker had always been a man of order, a man who believed that, with enough control, with enough effort, you could bend the world to your will. That's how he built his law career, ruthless and calculating, winning every case that came across his desk. But that same control he so expertly wielded in the courtroom, he demanded from his family. His wife, Claire, knew it better than anyone. She'd learned long ago that her opinions didn't matter. Her job was to keep the house immaculate, the kids perfect, and Jonathan's reputation untarnished. Yet behind Jonathan's ironclad demeanor, there was weakness. A craving for power that extended beyond the courtroom and into the shadows of his personal life. He controlled Claire, not with fists, but with manipulation, making sure she always felt like she wasn't quite good enough. That same manipulation extended to their two children, Evan and Samantha, who felt the suffocating weight of their father's expectations every single day. Claire's only solace came from the man across the street, Michael Holloway, handsome, charismatic, and the opposite of everything Jonathan stood for. He was easygoing, spontaneous, and worst of all for Claire, he listened. Their affair had started innocently enough. Late-night conversations on the porch after Claire had tucked the kids in and Jonathan was locked in his office, pretending to work late. But as the summer nights grew longer, so did their time together, and soon enough, what began as stolen glances turned into stolen moments. Claire had never felt so alive, but she also knew that if Jonathan ever found out, it would be the end of her. Evan Parker was everything his father expected him to be, on the surface. An all-American high school quarterback, charming, good grades, a future that was laid out before him like a red carpet. But inside, Evan was crumbling under the pressure. He hated the sport his father had forced on him since he could walk. He hated the constant demand for perfection, for dominance. It was suffocating, but most of all, he hated the secrets he had to keep, the lies he had to live every single day. Because Evan Parker was not the son his father thought he was. Evan had been hiding something for years, a relationship with his best friend, Jesse. Their love was secret, forbidden, and if Jonathan ever found out, Evan was sure his life would be over. The pressure, the lies, the fear of being exposed. It all built up inside Evan like a ticking time bomb, and as the summer of 2019 pressed on, that bomb was inching closer and closer to detonation. For Claire, life had become a delicate balancing act. Her affair with Michael filled the empty void Jonathan had created, but it also terrified her. Every time she slipped out of the house to see him, she feared it would be the last, that someone would see, that Jonathan would find out. The town's whispers had started. People saw the way she looked at Michael, the way they disappeared at the same time during those barbecues. Claire had no idea that her life was a performance on the edge of collapse. What she didn't know was that Michael had secrets of his own. His carefree charm hid a past that was far from innocent. And as much as Claire had come to trust him, to depend on him, she didn't realize she was stepping into a world of danger, a world where nothing was as it seemed. By August, the Parker family was teetering on the edge of disaster. Jonathan's grip on his family was tightening, Claire's affair was becoming harder to hide, and Evan was suffocating under the weight of his secret. All it would take was a single spark to ignite the firestorm. That spark came in the form of a letter. One late August evening, Claire received an unmarked envelope in the mail. Inside was a single photograph, her and Michael in a passionate embrace, caught in a moment they thought was private. Claire's hands shook as she read the short, scrawled note at the bottom. "I know what you've done. Tell him or I will." Her heart raced. She looked over her shoulder as if the walls themselves had eyes. The noose was tightening, and Claire knew that her time was running out. She had no idea who sent the letter, but the message was clear. Someone had been watching, and now she was trapped. She spent the rest of the night locked in the bathroom, staring at the photo, wondering how everything had come to this. How had her perfect life crumbled so quickly? And what was she going to do? She couldn't tell Jonathan. The thought alone sent chills down her spine. She couldn't leave either. He'd never let her take the kids. Claire was stuck with no way out, except to confront the storm head-on. Claire's mind raced as she stared at the photograph in her hands. The walls of her perfect life were closing in, and she knew she was running out of time. The idea of Jonathan finding out about her affair was terrifying, not just because of what he might do, but because of the ruin it would bring to their children, their family, and their standing in the community. Claire's hands trembled as she slipped the photo into her nightstand drawer, her heart pounding in her chest. Whoever sent the letter wanted something. But what? Claire didn't have much time to dwell on it. That night, as the family gathered for dinner, she noticed Evan was unusually quiet. He picked at his food, avoiding eye contact, and kept glancing out the window as if he were somewhere else entirely. Something was wrong, but Claire couldn't pinpoint what it was. Little did she know, Evan had received his own anonymous message that afternoon. A text message on his phone that read, "I know about Jesse. Tell your father or I will." Evan's stomach churned as he stared at his phone, the screen glowing in the dimly lit living room. It was as if someone was watching their every move, waiting for the perfect moment to tear the family apart. Evan felt trapped, just like his mother, though neither knew of the other's secret. The Parker family was crumbling under the weight of secrets and lies, each member walking on a tightrope, one wrong step away from disaster. Across the street, Michael Holloway stood by his front window, watching the lights in the Parker household flicker on and off. He had gotten too close to Claire. He knew that. What had started as a casual fling had quickly turned into something deeper, something far more dangerous. The problem was Michael wasn't exactly the man Claire thought he was. Michael had a past, one he had carefully buried when he moved to Newport 5 years earlier. He had left behind a life of debt, dangerous connections, and a record that, if uncovered, would destroy him. And now he was in over his head, tangled in an affair with the wife of one of the most powerful men in town. But Michael wasn't the only one with something to lose. He had been receiving messages too, anonymous threats about his affair with Claire. It was clear to him that whoever was behind the letters knew more than they should. They knew about his past, his debts, and they were using that information to pull the strings. Michael wasn't sure how much longer he could keep it all together. As the days passed, the tension in the Parker household became unbearable. Claire couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, and Evan's anxiety grew with each passing hour. Both mother and son were trapped in their own worlds of guilt and fear, but they had no idea that their secrets were connected by a single thread. A person who was determined to bring the entire family down. Jonathan, oblivious to the turmoil brewing in his home, remained as strict and controlling as ever. He had noticed Claire's recent distraction, but he dismissed it as stress from the kids or the usual pressures of suburban life. As for Evan, Jonathan was too focused on his son's football career to see what was really going on. He had big plans for Evan, and he wasn't about to let anything or anyone get in the way. It all came to a head on a hot August night. Claire had received yet another letter, this time with a more menacing tone. "You're running out of time. Tell him tonight." The pressure was unbearable. She couldn't sleep, couldn't think straight, and worst of all, she had no idea who was behind the threats. That night, while Jonathan was in his office and the kids were upstairs, Claire decided to confront Michael. She couldn't live like this anymore, hiding and sneaking around. She needed to end it. She grabbed her keys and headed across the street, her hands shaking as she knocked on Michael's door. When Michael opened the door, he could see the panic in her eyes. Claire stepped inside and immediately began pacing the room, her words spilling out in a frantic rush. She told Michael about the letters, the threats, the fear that was eating her alive. Michael, in turn, confessed that he too had been receiving messages. Whoever was behind this wasn't just after Claire, they were after both of them. As Claire and Michael pieced together the fragments of the mystery, they realized that they had both been played. Someone had orchestrated this, someone who knew about their affair, their secrets, and their vulnerabilities. But before they could figure out who was behind it all, there was a knock at the door. Claire froze. Her heart stopped as she glanced at Michael. He stepped forward and opened the door, revealing a figure standing in the darkness. Evan's face was pale, his eyes wide with shock and betrayal. He had followed his mother, his curiosity getting the better of him. And now, standing in the doorway of Michael's house, everything became clear. The affair, the lies, the secrecy. His mother, the woman he had trusted, had been living a double life. Without a word, Evan turned and ran. Claire's heart shattered as she called after him, but it was too late. The damage was done. Everything was unraveling, and there was no stopping it now. The next morning, Claire knew she had to face Jonathan. She had no choice. Evan knew the truth, and there was no way to contain the fallout any longer. But as Claire prepared herself for the inevitable confrontation, she received one final letter. This time, it wasn't a threat. It was a confession. The person behind the letters was someone she never expected. Jesse, Evan's best friend. The one person who had been there through all of his struggles was the mastermind behind the entire scheme. Jesse had been in love with Evan for years, but Evan had kept their relationship hidden, afraid of what his father would think. When Jesse discovered Claire's affair, he saw an opportunity. By exposing the Parker family's secrets, Jesse believed he could free Evan from the expectations and control of his father. He thought he was saving him. But in reality, Jesse had only set in motion a chain of events that would destroy the very person he loved. With the truth finally out in the open, the Parker family was left in ruins. Jonathan, furious and humiliated, filed for divorce and cut ties with Evan, who had decided to leave Newport altogether. Claire, devastated by the loss of her family, moved away to start over, though she knew she could never truly escape the consequences of her actions. As for Jesse, his plan had backfired in the worst way possible. He lost Evan, the one person he had done it all for, and was left to live with the guilt of having destroyed the Parker family. Newport remained as picturesque as ever, but beneath the surface, the scars of the Parker family's downfall would never fade. As the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place, the truth about the Parker family's collapse spread like wildfire throughout Newport. Gossip flew from house to house, whispered conversations over backyard fences and in the aisles of grocery stores. The perfect facade of the Parker family had been shattered, and now everyone was picking through the pieces. Jonathan Parker, a man who had always thrived on control, found his entire world slipping through his fingers. His reputation, his marriage, his relationship with his son, everything he had built was gone. The humiliation of Claire's affair with Michael was one thing, but Evan's secret relationship with Jesse was a betrayal he couldn't comprehend. Jonathan's fury was not just aimed at Claire and Evan, but at himself for not seeing the signs earlier. He had been so focused on molding Evan, into the perfect image of himself that he had missed the truth about who his son really was. Jonathan tried to channel his rage into his work, but even there, the whispers followed him. His colleagues no longer looked at him with respect, but with pity, as though his fall from grace was some kind of spectacle. The control he had spent his entire life cultivating had been stripped away, leaving him vulnerable for the first time. For Claire, the aftermath of the truth was unbearable. The life she had spent years pretending to love was gone, but instead of relief, she was left with a hollow ache. Michael had tried to reach out to her, but she couldn't bring herself to face him. The weight of what they had done, of the lives they had destroyed, was too much. She packed her things, left the house that had once been her prison, and disappeared without a word to anyone. Newport was no longer her home. It never had been. Claire knew she had to leave it all behind. She moved to a small town on the outskirts of the state, hoping that anonymity would bring her the peace she so desperately craved. But even as she tried to start over, the guilt followed her like a shadow. The image of Evan's face when he had discovered her affair haunted her, a constant reminder of the consequences of her actions. Evan, too, had left Newport. The town that had once been his entire world now felt like a prison he couldn't escape fast enough. After the truth about his relationship with Jesse came out, he had tried to reach out to his father, but Jonathan had refused to listen. For Jonathan, Evan's secret was more than just a disappointment. It was a personal failure. Evan had been the one thing Jonathan had complete control over, and now that control was gone. Evan left without saying goodbye to anyone. He took only what he could fit into his car and drove until the town was nothing but a memory in his rearview mirror. For the first time in his life, Evan was free. Free from his father's expectations, free from the secrets that had suffocated him for so long. But freedom came at a cost. The love he had shared with Jesse was gone, and the future he had once imagined seemed out of reach. As the miles passed by, Evan tried to focus on the road ahead, but the past still clung to him. He knew that healing would take time, but he also knew that Newport was a chapter of his life that had closed for good. Jesse, the mastermind behind the letters, was left to pick up the pieces of his own shattered world. He had believed that by exposing the truth, he could free Evan from the suffocating control of his father, but instead, he had destroyed everything. Evan had left, and with him, the future Jesse had imagined for them both. In the weeks that followed, Jesse tried to move on, but the guilt weighed him down like a lead weight. He had been driven by love, but love had led him down a dangerous path. Now, he was left with nothing but regret. He had hoped that by revealing the truth, he would be the hero in Evan's story, but instead, he had become the villain. Jesse spent his days in a daze, replaying the events over and over in his head, wondering if there had been another way. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had acted out of selfishness, not love. And now he had to live with the consequences. As the dust settled, Newport returned to its normal routine. The Parker family was no longer the subject of daily gossip, but their downfall had left a mark on the town that wouldn't be easily forgotten. People went back to their lives, but the story of the Parker family became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even in the most picturesque places, darkness could still lurk beneath the surface. The house on Maplewood Drive, once the epitome of suburban success, now stood empty. The lawn, once meticulously maintained, grew wild, and the windows, once sparkling clean, were now covered in dust. The Parker family had been the heart of the neighborhood, but now they were just a ghost, a memory of what had once been. And as the years passed, the people of Newport moved on, but they would always remember the summer of 2019, when the Parker family's secrets came to light and everything changed. In the end, the story of the Parker family was a tragedy. A family destroyed by secrets, lies, and the pressures of perfection. Jonathan, Claire, Evan, and Jesse had all been caught in a web of their own making, and by the time they realized it, it was too late. The town of Newport continued on, the facade of perfection still intact, but the cracks in the surface were there for anyone willing to look. The Parker family's downfall was a reminder that no matter how perfect things may seem on the outside, no one is immune to the darkness that can fester beneath the surface. And as Newport's residents went about their lives, they couldn't help but wonder, who would be next? As the summer of 2019 gave way to the chill of autumn, the Parker family's secrets had finally come to light, and the damage was irreversible. What had started as subtle fractures had now shattered their once perfect lives beyond repair. But the story was far from over. The aftermath of the revelations only heightened the tension, turning Newport from a quiet suburban haven into the stage for the final act of a drama no one could have predicted. Claire was gone, Evan had fled, and Jonathan remained. But what had once been his empire, the immaculate life he'd built, was nothing but ruins. He sat alone in the echoing emptiness of the house, the walls still covered in family portraits that now felt like relics of a life that didn't belong to him anymore. But deep down, there was still one final twist, one last thread of control that Jonathan was not willing to let go of. Jonathan Parker had always been a man who refused to lose, and even as everything crumbled around him, he couldn't accept that this was how it would end. He was a master manipulator, a man who had always found a way to bend the world to his will. And now, as the final act of his life played out, he wasn't going to let go without a fight. He knew where Evan had gone. The boy thought he was clever, thought he could escape, but Jonathan had always had his eye on him. Evan had fled to stay with an old friend in a distant town, trying to rebuild his life out of the ruins of his past. But Jonathan wasn't ready to let Evan slip through his fingers. In his mind, Evan was still his son, his project, and Jonathan was ready to bring him back, to mold him into the person he was always meant to be. Jonathan made the call. It wasn't to Evan, but to the one person he knew could bring his son back into his orbit, Jesse. Jesse had spent the months after Evan's departure in a haze of regret and guilt, isolated and broken by the weight of his actions. But when Jonathan Parker called, he knew he couldn't ignore it. Jonathan played his cards perfectly, offering Jesse exactly what he needed. The chance for redemption. Jonathan convinced Jesse that he could help him bring Evan back, that the only way to fix everything was for them to work together. Jesse, desperate to make things right. But Jonathan's intentions weren't to reunite the boys. He had no interest in Jesse's redemption. This was about one thing only: control. If Jonathan couldn't have the perfect family, he would at least regain power over the one piece of his life that had eluded him. In early November, Jonathan and Jesse made their move. Jonathan sent Jesse to meet Evan first, to lure him back to Newport under the guise of making peace. Jesse, naive and hopeful, believed that this was the path to healing. But when he arrived at Evan's new apartment, things didn't go as planned. Evan, who had spent the past few months trying to rebuild his shattered life, was furious when he saw Jesse at his door. The betrayal still stung, and the wounds Jesse had inflicted were too deep to heal with a simple apology. As Jesse stumbled over his words, trying to explain why he had come, Evan's anger boiled over. "You ruined everything," Evan hissed, his voice filled with bitterness. "You think you can just show up here and fix it?" Jesse's face fell. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this. I thought I was helping you." Evan laughed bitterly. "Helping? You destroyed my family. You destroyed us." The tension in the room was suffocating, and just as Evan was about to tell Jesse to leave, a shadow appeared in the doorway. It was Jonathan. The confrontation that followed was brutal. Jonathan tried to assert his dominance, to manipulate Evan into coming home. But Evan had changed. He wasn't the same boy who had been suffocated by his father's expectations. He stood his ground, refusing to let Jonathan drag him back into the life he had fought so hard to escape. As the argument escalated, the years of resentment, fear, and control came to a head. Jonathan, unable to bear the thought of losing his grip on his son, lashed out in a way he had never done before. His words were venomous, cutting deep into Evan's insecurities, trying to tear him down the same way he always had. But this time, it didn't work. Evan, for the first time in his life, stood tall against his father. He told Jonathan exactly what he had been holding back for years. The truth about how he had felt, how he had suffocated under his father's expectations, how he had lived in fear of never being good enough. And as the final words left Evan's mouth, Jonathan snapped. It happened in an instant. Jonathan lunged at his son, the years of rage and frustration boiling over. The room erupted in chaos as the three men struggled, but in the end, it was Jesse who made the split-second decision that would change everything. He grabbed a lamp from the nearby table and swung it, striking Jonathan in the head. Jonathan collapsed to the ground, unconscious. For a moment, there was silence. The room was still, the air thick with the weight of what had just happened. Evan and Jesse stood frozen, staring at Jonathan's motionless body on the floor. Jesse's hands trembled. "I didn't mean to." Evan knelt beside his father, checking for a pulse. Jonathan was alive, but barely. The blow had been severe, and the consequences were clear. They couldn't just walk away from this. Jonathan had to be taken to a hospital, but the question remained, what would happen next? Evan looked at Jesse, his mind racing. "We have to call for help." Jesse nodded, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. They both knew that this was the end of the line. The final chapter in the story of the Parker family had been written, and there was no going back. Jonathan Parker survived the attack, but the man he had been was gone. The injury left him with permanent cognitive damage, stripping away the sharp mind that had once controlled his world. He was no longer the dominating figure in Evan's life. He was just a shell of the man he used to be. Evan and Jesse, on the other hand, were left to pick up the pieces. They had survived the storm, but the scars of what had happened would remain with them forever. Newport, the town that had once seemed so perfect, was now a distant memory. Just another place that had been left behind in the wreckage of the Parker family's fall. Claire, far away from the chaos, never returned. She lived the rest of her life in quiet anonymity, haunted by the choices she had made but free from the prison she had once called home. And as for the town of Newport, it went on, as towns like that always do, with new families moving in, unaware of the dark history that had unfolded behind the white picket fences. The Parker family became just another ghost story, whispered about in hushed tones by those who still remembered. But for those who had lived it, the story of the Parker family would never be forgotten.